The moment she corrected him, the great hall fell so silent you could hear a candle flame gutter 100 feet away. She was Linnea, a bookmender, a woman who existed in the margins of footnotes and the scent of decaying paper. He was Lord Alaric, master of the sprawling, shadow-choked estate of Blackwood Manor, a man whose stillness was more terrifying than any beast's roar. The world's most respected academics stood before him, preening and boasting. But it was Linnea, the quiet assistant no one had bothered to introduce, who spoke the truth about the crumbling manuscript in his hands. And for the first time in 500 years, he felt something other than the cold weight of time. He saw her. If you believe that being truly seen by the right person can change the world, type "witness" below and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you need to know about the dust. Linnea's life was measured in it. The fine, pale dust of vellum, the gritty, dark dust of crumbling leather bindings, the soft, gray dust of forgotten archives. She lived in a small room above a print shop in the city, a space that always smelled of paper and glue and the faint, acidic tang of old ink. Her hands, though often stained, were her genius. They could coax a torn page back into a seamless hole, strengthen a failing spine, and read the history of a book not just from its words, but from its very bones. It was a quiet, solitary art, and she was a master. But the world of letters was a world of men. Loud, arrogant men like Mr. Albright, a celebrated historian who had built his career on the foundations of other people's discoveries. He had been her mentor once. He had seen her talent, and he had used it. Her meticulous research on the paper mills of the 15th century had become his award-winning monograph. Her name appeared only in a brief, dismissive acknowledgement at the end. The wound was deep. It had taught her to be invisible, to keep her head down and her observations to herself. She learned that her knowledge was a commodity to be taken, not a gift to be shared. So when Mr. Albright received the summons from the enigmatic Lord Alaric of Blackwood Manor, he saw an opportunity for greater glory. The Lord's library was the stuff of legend, a collection untouched for centuries, and he needed an expert to assess its condition. Albright, of course, presented himself as that expert. He brought Linnea along for one reason only: to do the tedious work of cataloging the decay while he postured for their mysterious patron. She was introduced, if one could call it that, as his aide. Lord Alaric had not so much as glanced in her direction. He was a figure carved from winter itself, tall and severe, dressed in black velvet that seemed to drink the candlelight. He stood by the great hearth, his face a mask of aristocratic indifference. But there was a coldness that emanated from him, a palpable chill that had nothing to do with the drafty stone walls of the hall. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper around him, darker, as if they were paying him homage. The scholars he had summoned buzzed around a long oak table where a single, massive book lay open. They offered their theories with theatrical confidence. One declared it a 16th-century Florentine work. Another argued for a Spanish origin, pointing to the tooling on the leather. Mr. Albright, in his element, boomed, "It is, without question, a northern German liturgical text, circa 1480. The particular use of iron gall ink is unmistakable." Linnea, standing forgotten near the doorway, could see they were all wrong. From across the room, she recognized the faint, web-like pattern of the paper's watermark, visible only where the page had thinned with age. She knew that watermark. She had spent a month tracing its origin for a project Albright had later claimed as his own. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Stay quiet," a voice in her head screamed. "It's what you do. You are the assistant, the aide, the footnote. But the book, the poor, misidentified book cried out to her. It was a living thing being defamed. She took a single step forward, then another. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but it cut through the din like a shard of glass. You are mistaken, sir. Every head turned. Mr. Albright's face flushed a dangerous, mottled crimson. He opened his mouth to berate her, to put her back in her place, but he never got the chance. Lord Alaric moved. He didn't walk. He simply arrived. One moment he was by the fire, the next he was standing beside the table, his gaze fixed not on the book, but on her. His eyes were the color of obsidian, but as he looked at her, a faint, impossible crimson light seemed to kindle in their depths. The candles in the hall flickered wildly, though there was no breeze. "Explain," he commanded. His voice was not loud, but it resonated in the very stone of the floor. It was a voice like smoke and old wine, a sound that held the weight of ages. Linnea's fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but the certainty of her knowledge was a steadying warmth. She walked to the table, her gaze respectfully on the manuscript, not on the terrifying man beside her. She pointed with a steady finger. The ink is indeed iron gall, but the fading pattern isn't consistent with German methods. They used a higher concentration of vitriol, which bites into the page differently over time. She then indicated the watermark. And that is the mark of the Dubois paper mill in the Loire Valley. They operated for less than 20 years, from 1452 to 1471. This book is French, and it is older than any of you have guessed. Silence. Thick, heavy, and absolute. Mr. Albright sputtered. "Nonsense! A provincial paper mill? This girl is a mender, a glorified book gluer. She knows nothing of provenance." Lord Alaric did not look at him. His eyes remained on Linnea. He saw the faint ink stains on her fingers, the focused intensity in her clear gray eyes, the quiet strength in her posture. He saw the mind behind the observation. He saw the truth. "And you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more intimidating than a shout, "are a glorified peacock. You see only what you wish to see, what enhances your own reflection." He raised his gaze, sweeping it over the assembled academics. The chill in the room deepened, and the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe at the edges of the candlelight. "You are all dismissed," he stated. It was not a request. There was a scramble of shocked protests, of bruised egos and confusion. Albright stared, aghast. "My lord, I must insist. This is an insult." Alaric's head tilted, a slow, predatory movement. "Insist on nothing in my house. Leave, now." The men gathered their things and fled, casting fearful, resentful glances back at Linnea. She stood frozen, a small, still point in the swirling chaos of their departure. When the great oak doors boomed shut, leaving the three of them in the echoing hall, Albright rounded on her. "You foolish girl! You have ruined me! You have ruined everything!" Before she could even flinch, Lord Alaric's hand shot out, not touching Albright, but hovering an inch from his chest. The temperature dropped so suddenly that Linnea saw frost crystallize on the velvet of Albright's coat. "She has ruined nothing." Alaric's voice was dangerously soft. "You did that yourself, with your pride and your ignorance. Go, and do not let me see your face in this valley again." Albright, pale and trembling, finally understood. He was in the presence of something far older and more powerful than a reclusive nobleman. He turned and practically ran from the hall. The doors closed again, leaving Linnea alone with the Lord of Blackwood Manor. The silence that fell was different now. It was not empty, but filled with a heavy, waiting presence. She finally dared to look at him. He was watching her with an unnerving intensity, as if he were reading the very pages of her soul. "You have a name," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "Linnea, my lord." "Linnea," he repeated, the name sounding strange and ancient on his tongue. "You see things others do not." "I see what is there," she replied simply. "A rare gift," he murmured, his gaze falling to the book on the table. He gestured for her to come closer. Hesitantly, she did. He stood beside her, and the cold he radiated was so profound it felt like it could leach the very warmth from her bones. "This library," he began, his voice low, "is my history. It is my memory. And it is dying. The damp of this valley, the slow crawl of time, it is all turning to dust. Like this one." He gently touched the edge of the manuscript. "I did not summon those fools for their opinions. I summoned them to find a cure. I was looking for a true artisan, a preserver." His obsidian eyes, still glowing with that faint crimson ember, met hers. "It seems I have found one." He made her an offer that was less a proposal and more a royal decree. She would stay at Blackwood Manor. She would be given quarters, a workshop, any tool or material she required. In return, she would save his books. All of them. Starting with his most prized, most vulnerable collection. She should have been terrified. She should have refused and run back to the familiar, dusty safety of her life. But as she looked at the ancient, beautiful book, and then at the ancient, haunted man beside it, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since before Albright had stolen her voice. Here, her knowledge was not a thing to be plundered. It was a thing that was needed. It was a thing that was seen. "I will stay," she said. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. It was not triumph. It was not relief. It was something closer to recognition, as if he had been waiting a very long time. "Good," was all he said. And so Linnea's world shrank to the size of Blackwood Manor, and at the same time expanded into an eternity of history. She was given a suite of rooms in a wing of the castle that was less drafty than the rest, with a fireplace that was always lit, though she never saw anyone tend it. Her workshop was a vast, vaulted chamber adjoining the main library, filled with tables of polished oak and cabinets stocked with everything she could ever dream of. Vellum from unborn calves, inks ground from rare minerals, silks from the farthest east for binding threads. Her first days were spent in solitude, assessing the collection. It was a task of heartbreaking scale. Centuries of neglect had taken their toll. Books were swollen with damp, their pages a tapestry of mold. Leather bindings were cracked and brittle, but the collection itself, it was magnificent. There were books here that the world believed lost forever. First-hand accounts of fallen empires, scientific treatises that predated the accepted masters, poetry written in languages that no longer had a name. Lord Alaric remained a distant, silent presence. She would feel him, more than see him. A sudden chill in the air, a shadow in a doorway that seemed to move with its own volition. The sense of being watched by an unseen, ancient intelligence. Sometimes, late at night, as she worked by the light of a dozen candles, he would appear at the far end of the library, standing motionless among the towering shelves, a sentinel guarding his own history. He never spoke of his true nature, But Linnea was not a fool. She saw the signs, the way he never ate or drank in her presence, the inhuman speed with which he could cross a vast room, the unnatural stillness that was less about composure and more about the absolute absence of life's involuntary movements. And his eyes, those crimson-tinged eyes that seemed to hold the darkness of 1,000 starless nights. She was not afraid. Her curiosity, the very quality that had been punished by Albright, was stronger than her fear. She was in the presence of the greatest mystery she had ever encountered, and her instinct was not to flee, but to understand. After a month of preliminary work, he finally revealed her true purpose. He led her one evening not into the main library, but down a winding stone staircase to a circular chamber deep in the foundations of the castle. The air here was colder still and dry as bone. In the center of the room, on a black marble pedestal, rested a single, large volume bound in what looked like hardened shadow. "This," Alaric said, his voice reverent, "is the Umbral Codex. It is the heart of this house, the heart of my line." The book was unlike anything she had ever seen. The cover was cool and smooth, but it seemed to absorb the light, giving off no reflection. The pages were not vellum or paper, but something impossibly thin and pale, like stretched and cured moonlight. The script was elegant and complex, written in an ink that shimmered with a faint, internal silver light. But it was dying. The light in the ink was fading, turning to a dull gray. The edges of the pages were beginning to fray, not into dust, but into nothingness, as if they were unraveling from the fabric of reality itself. "What is it?" she whispered, afraid to touch it. "It is a history, a spell book, and a cage," he answered, his gaze locked on the failing tome. "My ancestors were involved in arts that tamed the darkness. They bound the shadows to our will, made them our servants, our strength. This book contains the rituals, the commands, the very grammar of that power." He paused, and for the first time Linnea heard something like vulnerability in his voice. "But the bond weakens with time. The knowledge fades. As the ink dims, my control slips. The shadows that serve this house, they grow restless, wild." Suddenly, she understood. The shadows that moved on their own, the oppressive weight of darkness in the castle's corners. It wasn't just a feeling. It was a literal presence, a power he was struggling to contain. "The book is the anchor," he continued. "Without it, the power will consume its master. It will be unbound. I will become a mindless horror, and this valley will be drowned in a living night." He finally looked at her, and the cold mask of the aristocrat was gone. In its place was the desperate plea of a man, a being, staring into an abyss. "The scholars I summoned believed I wanted them to preserve old leather and paper. I needed someone who could preserve magic, someone who could read the life of the object itself, someone who could restore fading light." He needed her. Not her hands as a tool, not her mind as a resource to be mined, but the entirety of her unique, peculiar genius. The world had called her a book gluer. This ancient, terrifying creature was calling her a miracle worker. "I can't promise I can fix it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've never worked on anything like this. I don't know what the pages are made of, or the ink." "You will have whatever you need," he said. "Ask, and it will be provided." His voice was low and intense. "Save it, Linnea. Save us." Would you have stayed, knowing you were being asked to mend the very fabric of a monster's soul? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. Linnea did not run. She did the only thing she knew how to do. She began to work. The Umbral Codex became her entire world. She had it moved to her workshop, placed on a specially prepared table under controlled light. Her first days were spent in pure observation. She studied it through magnifying glasses, sketching the complex characters, noting the exact rate of decay. She discovered the pages were woven from the spun cocoons of a species of moth that fed only on moon blossoms, flowers she later found growing in a secluded, walled garden of the estate, a garden that only bloomed under the light of a full moon. The ink, she eventually deduced after weeks of careful, non-invasive tests, was not ink at all. It was a bioluminescent fungus, ground into a liquid suspension with dew collected from the petals of those same flowers. It was living light, and it was starving. Their nights fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Linnea would work, her focus absolute, while Alaric would watch from the shadows of the workshop. He never interfered, never questioned, but his presence was a constant, a silent, brooding weight. It was no longer intimidating. It had become comforting, a silent partnership. She would talk to him as she worked, her voice soft in the vast, quiet space. She told him about the paper, about the ink, about the unique stitch used in the binding. At first, he would only listen. Then, he began to answer. He told her the history of the moths, of the garden planted by a long-dead ancestress who was a botanist of the arcane. He spoke of the scribe who had penned the codex, a monk who had been blind, who wrote not by sight, but by feeling the flow of power into the page. He was opening his world to her, page by page, just as she was trying to save his. One night, exhausted, she reached for a jar of pigment, and her hand brushed against his. He was standing closer than she had realized. The cold was shocking, a deep, penetrating chill that felt like touching a marble statue in the dead of winter. She gasped and pulled back. "I apologize," he said, his voice flat, his hand retreating into the shadows of his sleeve. "I forget my own nature." He began to turn away, the familiar mask of distance settling back over his features. But Linnea found her courage. "Don't," she said softly. He stopped. She reached out again, slowly, giving him every chance to pull away. She laid her warm, ink-stained fingers against the back of his cold, pale hand. The contrast was startling. Her warmth against his absolute cold. Life against something else. He stood utterly, inhumanly still. She felt a faint tremor run through him, the first involuntary movement she had ever witnessed. She did not pull away. Instead, she gently closed her hand around his. She was not trying to warm him. She was simply holding him, seeing him, accepting the cold as a part of him, not a barrier to him. He did not speak. He did not move. But she saw the crimson embers in his eyes glow brighter, warmer, like the heart of a forge. It was a conversation without words, an acceptance more profound than any vow. In that moment, the space between them, the centuries and the very nature of their beings, seemed to shrink to nothing. From then on, something shifted. The wall of his reserve began to crumble, stone by stone. He started bringing her things. a cup of rare, fragrant tea left on her workbench in the morning, still steaming though she never heard him enter. A heavy woolen shawl, impossibly soft, that he said was woven from the fleece of a flock his family had tended 500 years ago. One night, he led her to the moon garden. Under the silver light, the pale, spectral flowers unfurled their petals, releasing a scent of night-blooming jasmine and something else, something wild and magical. The air was filled with the silent flutter of the great pearlescent moths. They stood together in the heart of the glowing garden, and he told her his own story. He spoke of his human life, of the woman he had loved and lost to a plague. He spoke of the transformation, the lonely cold centuries that followed. He spoke of watching the world change, of watching everyone he had ever known turn to dust, until he was nothing more than a ghost haunting the tomb of his own memories. To be immortal, he said, his voice quiet and melancholic, is to be the sole audience to a play where every other actor dies. You are left alone on the stage, in a theater of ghosts. Linnea listened, her heart aching for the profound loneliness he described. She saw past the monster, past the powerful lord, and saw the prisoner. For the first time, someone was seeing his burden, not just his power. Her compassion was a balm on a wound that had festered for centuries. As her work on the codex progressed, she found she could not just replicate the ink. She had to improve upon it. She introduced a stabilizing agent, a trace of powdered moonstone, to make the light last longer, burn brighter. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to retrace the fading script, character by character. And as she did, she felt the power in the room shift. The oppressive weight of the shadows lessened. The air in the castle grew less cold. Light was returning, not just to the book, but to the world around it. The change was most apparent in Alaric himself. The severe lines of his face seemed to soften. The crimson in his eyes was less a warning and more a quiet hearthfire. He began to spend more time in the workshop, not in the shadows, but sitting in a chair near her table, simply watching her work, his presence a quiet anchor in the long nights. But light always attracts the dark. Mr. Albright had not disappeared. Humiliated and furious, he had festered in his own resentment. He had seen the power in Blackwood Manor, and his academic jealousy had curdled into something far more dangerous: greed. He convinced himself that the reclusive lord was a monster hoarding priceless treasures, and that the foolish girl was under his demonic thrall. He began to gather allies, not scholars this time, but men who dealt in fear and fire. Self-proclaimed hunters, a motley collection of zealots, mercenaries, and superstitious villagers, he whipped into a frenzy with tales of a vampiric nobleman and a captive maiden. He used Linnea's name as his proof, twisting her willing work into a story of bewitchment and dark sacrifice. To get closer to the manor, Linnea had taken to working in a small, abandoned gamekeeper's cottage at the edge of the Blackwood forest. The light there was better during the day, and some of the more delicate restorative processes needed a humidity the castle couldn't provide. Alaric had protested, wanting her within the safety of his walls, but she had insisted. She was not a prisoner, and the work demanded it. Reluctantly, he had agreed, surrounding the cottage with unseen watchers, his own shadows, tasked with her protection. Albright's spies reported this. They saw it as the perfect opportunity. The creature of the night would be helpless to protect her during the day, trapped in his dark fortress. They could seize the girl, force her to reveal the location of the Lord's treasures, and then burn the evil from the valley forever. The attack came at high noon. Linnea was working on the final page of the Umbral Codex, her brow furrowed in concentration, when the sound of shouting shattered the forest's peace. She looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. Through the cottage window, she saw them. A dozen men, armed with crossbows, swords, and torches, forming a rough circle around the small building. At their head stood Mr. Albright, his face alight with righteous fury and avarice. "Linnea," he bellowed, "come out! We are here to save you from that beast!" She saw the truth in his eyes. He wasn't there to save her. He was there to use her, just as he always had. She felt a cold dread, but it was quickly replaced by a hot, fierce anger. They were not just threatening her. They were threatening Alaric. They were threatening the fragile peace they had built together in the quiet hours of the night. The shadows under the eaves of the cottage deepened, writhing like angered snakes. She could feel Alaric's distant fury, his helplessness. He was in the castle, miles away, trapped by the hateful sun. "Give us the girl!" one of the hunters shouted, brandishing a torch, "or we'll burn the witch out with her master's whore." Linnea's hand went to the finished codex on her table. The script glowed with a steady, brilliant silver light. The power within it felt calm, centered, and strong. Just as her own heart felt, surprisingly, calm and strong. She would not be their victim. She would not be his damsel. She walked to the door, her back straight. "I am no one's captive," she called out, her voice clear and ringing. "I am here by choice. Leave this place." Albright laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "The creature has twisted your mind, girl. We will purge you both." He gave a signal. "Burn it." A man stepped forward, his torch held high, ready to set the dry thatch of the roof ablaze. Linnea braced herself, her mind racing, trying to think of a way out, a way to protect the book, to protect herself. And then the forest fell silent. A new figure had appeared at the edge of the clearing, standing at the mouth of the path that led back to the manor. It was Alaric. He was standing in the full, brutal, unforgiving glare of the midday sun. For a moment, no one seemed to comprehend what they were seeing. A creature of absolute darkness, standing in the heart of the light. Then the horror began. A faint, thin line of smoke began to rise from his exposed hands and face. His dark, formal coat began to smolder at the shoulders. The hunters stared, frozen between triumph and terror. This was what they wanted. The monster brought into the light, vulnerable, dying. But no one had expected this. No one had expected him to walk into his own execution willingly. He took a step forward. His skin, where the sun touched it, began to blister and char. A sound of sheer agony, a low, guttural hiss escaped his lips, but he did not stop. He took another step, and another, his eyes never leaving Linnea, who stood frozen in the doorway of the cottage. In his eyes, she saw no fear, only a fierce, unwavering determination. He was walking through fire for her. He was embracing the one thing that could destroy him, to stand between her and the world. The first wisps of flame began to lick at the edges of his velvet coat. The smell of burning fabric and something else, something acrid and terrible, filled the air. The sight was so horrific, so unnatural, that several of the hunters backed away, their bravado melting into primal fear. A monster who dies in the dark is a foe. A monster who walks into the sun for love is a god. "Alaric, no!" Linnea screamed, her voice breaking. He did not look away from her. His gaze was an anchor, a promise. He raised a smoking hand, not towards his attackers, but towards the tree line behind them, and from the deepest, oldest shadows of the Blackwood, the darkness answered. It was not the wild, uncontrolled presence of before. It was a focused, disciplined force. Tendrils of pure night, cold and solid, shot out from the woods. They moved with silent, impossible speed, wrapping around crossbows and wrenching them from nerveless hands, snuffing out torches with a suffocating embrace, tripping and disarming the hunters with contemptuous ease. The men cried out in terror, fighting against an enemy they couldn't strike. A living night that was now utterly obedient to its burning master. Within seconds, the hunters were disarmed, scattered, and broken. Only Albright remained, standing paralyzed before the slowly advancing, burning figure of the vampire king. Alaric stopped a few feet from him. His face was a ruin of burns, his clothes were smoldering, but his crimson eyes burned brighter than the sun itself. His voice, when he spoke, was a raw, rasping sound, the voice of a man being flayed alive. "You sought to use her," he rasped, smoke curling from his lips. "You saw her light, and all you could think to do was stand in it and call the shadow you cast your own." He looked past Albright, his burning gaze sweeping over the cowering hunters. "This man did not come here to fight evil. He came because she exposed him for the fraud he is. He stole her work, her voice, and when she found it again, he sought to silence her with fire." The truth of his words, spoken by a being in the throes of an agonizing death, had more weight than any sermon. The hunters looked from the burning lord to the pale, trembling Albright. They saw the petty, pathetic truth. They had been duped. They were the tools of a bitter, jealous man. One by one they turned and fled, melting back into the woods, abandoning their cause and their leader. Albright stood alone, facing the smoldering incarnation of a love he could never comprehend. He finally broke, turning to run, but a single, solid tendril of shadow snapped out and wrapped around his ankle, bringing him crashing to the ground. Alaric looked down at him, not with hatred, but with a vast, ancient pity. "You are not worth the ash I am becoming," he whispered. Then he turned his back on him and took a final, stumbling step towards the cottage, towards Linnea. His strength finally gave out. He collapsed at the threshold, his body smoking, the sunlight still searing his back. Linnea rushed to him, heedless of the heat, and with all her strength, dragged him out of the sun and into the relative darkness of the cottage. She slammed the door shut, plunging the room into shadow. He lay on the floor, groaning, his body a canvas of horrific burns. The smell was sickening. She fell to her knees beside him, tears streaming down her face, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch, afraid of the pain she would cause. "Why?" she sobbed. "Why would you do that?" He reached up a trembling, blackened hand and touched her cheek. His touch was no longer cold. It was searing hot with the sun's stolen fire. "Because you," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper, his crimson eyes full of a light that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with her. "You are worth the sun." Time passed. The seasons turned over Blackwood Manor, but inside its stone walls, a quiet eternity had begun. The umbral codex rested in the great library, its script glowing with a fierce, steady light, its power now a calm, protective hum that suffused the entire estate. The shadows were no longer wild things, but gentle guardians, moving with a silent grace. Alaric healed. The process was slow, agonizing, and left him with scars. His skin, once unnaturally pale and smooth, now bore a faint, silvery tracery across his hands and the side of his face, a permanent reminder of the sun's kiss. Linnea thought they were beautiful. They were the proof of his love, written on his very skin. He was no longer a flawless, cold statue. He was hers, marked and real. The world outside forgot them. Mr. Albright, abandoned and disgraced, vanished into obscurity, his reputation shattered. Linnea's old life was a ghost, a story that belonged to someone else. Her new life was here, in the quiet grandeur of the castle, surrounded by the books she had saved, and the man she had saved in turn. She was no longer a footnote. She was the author of this new chapter, the acknowledged mistress of Blackwood, her name whispered with awe by the few locals who served the estate. She was the one who had tamed the vampire king, though she knew in her heart she had not tamed him. She had freed him. One evening, they were in the library, the firelight dancing on the spines of 1,000 rescued books. Linnea was sitting on a low stool, leaning against his chair, while he read from a book of ancient poetry. His voice, now fully recovered, was the same deep, resonant sound she had first heard, but all its cold edges had been worn away, leaving only warmth. He finished a verse and closed the book, his scarred hand coming to rest on her hair. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the fire. "Linnea," he said softly, breaking the quiet. "Yes?" "The pages of your life are turning," he said, his voice gentle. "They are vellum, strong and beautiful, but they are not infinite. I can make them so. I can give you the same endless pages I have." He was offering her eternity, the final, greatest gift he possessed, the choice to join him in his endless night. She leaned back, turning her head to look up at him. She saw the question in his eyes, the hope, but also the fear that she would say no, the fear of being alone again. She lifted her hand and gently traced the silver scars on his. She remembered the smell of burning velvet, the sight of him walking through an agony she could barely imagine, all for her. Her choice had been made that day, in the heart of the sun. "You once told me," she said, her voice soft but sure, "that to be immortal is to be left alone in a theater of ghosts." A shadow of the old pain crossed his features. "It is." "Then you won't be," she said simply. "You will never be alone on that stage again." She took his hand, her warmth enveloping the cool, scarred skin. "My answer is yes." The relief that washed over his face was so profound it was heartbreaking. He leaned down, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of cold, predatory passion, but one of deep, abiding love. A promise, not of darkness, but of a shared eternity of quiet, fire-lit nights, of endless stories, of a love that was strong enough to face the sun. His other hand came up to cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. His touch was still cool, a familiar reminder of what he was. But it was a cold she now craved, a cold that felt like coming home. For more stories where quiet compassion conquers ancient loneliness, and where an overlooked skill becomes the key to saving a soul, subscribe to Herb Files. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.